The cold wind was almost biting as Brett walked through the deserted streets of Charleston that night. The few streetlights created shadows that danced on the worn facades of the buildings, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. He pulled his thin jacket closer to his body, trying to protect himself from the cold, but the worn fabric offered little comfort. The guitar hanging from his back swayed slightly, and the weight seemed heavier than usual, as if the responsibility he was carrying had also accumulated there. Inside him, the whirlwind of thoughts was deafening. The image of Dorothy, lying in that hospital bed, her face pale and her breathing shallow, wouldn't leave his mind. Brett knew that time was running out. Every day that passed without getting enough money was like watching sand pour through a cruel hourglass. He couldn't fail. Not with Dorothy, the only person who had loved him unconditionally for as long as he could remember. The shelter where he lived was dark and full of strict rules. Miners weren't allowed out after curfew, but Linda, the shelter cook, had become his ally. "You're a good boy, Brett," she said every night, handing him a sandwich wrapped in paper. "I can't do much, but I'll do what I can." Her gaze was both stern and tender, like that of someone who had seen the worst of the world, but still believed in small miracles. Linda would help him escape through the back door, where he would cross a dark alley and take the path that led to the central square. The journey was always tense. He had to sneak around corners, avoid the shelter guards, and deal with the dangers of the street. Every sound, be it the distant rumble of a car or the bark of a dog, set his heart racing. He knew that if he was caught, he would be severely punished, and all his nights of effort would be in vain. The central square was a mixture of charm and melancholy. During the day, it was a vibrant place, full of tourists and street musicians showing off their talents. But at night, under the pale glow of the street lamps and with most of the stores closed, the place took on an almost magical air, a perfect setting for dreams and despair to meet. Brett spotted Thompson, the street musician who was helping him, tuning his guitar under a lamppost. Thompson was a middle-aged man with messy grey hair and clothes that had seen better days. He looked sloppy, but his eyes shone with an intensity that contradicted his appearance. "You came," he said, smiling sideways as he adjusted the strings of his instrument. "I knew you wouldn't give up." Brett tried to smile back, but anxiety gripped his chest like an invisible hand. He stopped next to Thompson and put the guitar down, adjusting the small portable amplifier and the old microphone the musician had lent him. His throat was dry, and he had to swallow several times before he could speak. "Are there enough people tonight?" asked Brett, looking around. Thompson shrugged. "A few people, but don't worry about that. You don't need a crowd to change someone's life." He touched the boy's shoulder, an attempt to convey confidence. "Just sing, Brett. Let the music do the work." Brett took a deep breath, holding the microphone with trembling hands. He knew that at that moment there was no room for error. Every note had to be perfect, every word had to reach people's hearts. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself be carried away by memories of Dorothy singing to him as a child. "Music heals, Brett," she would say, her voice as soft as a warm blanket on a cold night. "When all seems lost, sing." He opened his eyes and began to sing. His voice echoed through the square, piercing the frosty air like a soft flame that warmed the hearts of the few who stopped to listen. There was something about Brett's voice that was hard to explain. A vulnerability that touched the soul, a sincerity that seemed impossible to find in the modern world. He wasn't just singing, he was telling his story, pouring his pain and his hope into every word. Thompson accompanied him on the guitar, but almost invisibly, letting Brett's voice take center stage. The few passers-by stopped, forming a small circle around the two. Some threw coins and dollar bills into the small open guitar case on the ground, but others just stood there, mesmerized by the music. At that moment, Brett felt less alone. It was as if, for a few minutes, his pain was shared with those people, and that made it more bearable. But he knew that the moment was brief. As soon as the song was over, he would return to the harsh reality of his life, a boy with no family, no money, and no time. The performance ended, and Thompson smiled approvingly. "You've got something special, kid. Something the world needs to hear." Brett lowered his gaze to the guitar case, where a few coins glinted in the streetlight. It wasn't much, but it was something. He carefully put the money in his pocket, silently thanking each person who had contributed. "Come back tomorrow," said Thompson as he put his guitar away. "The world needs more nights like this." Brett nodded, but knew that every night that passed meant less time to save Dorothy. As he walked back to the shelter, the silence of the night seemed heavier than ever. He held his guitar tightly, as if it were his shield against the darkness around him. When he arrived at the shelter, Linda was waiting for him at the back, with her arms crossed and a worried expression. "You're late," she said, glancing at her watch. "Has something happened?" Brett shook his head, trying to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "Just more people in the square. It took me a while to get out." Linda sighed, but didn't say anything else. She knew that this boy was carrying a lot more weight than he should. "Go to sleep. You need to rest." Brett obeyed, but as he lay on the narrow bed in his dormitory, sleep seemed impossible. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about Dorothy, thinking about how time was running out. Silent tears streamed down his face, but he wiped them away quickly. He couldn't give up. Not now. Brett woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in the shelter corridor. The supervisor, Mr. Carter, was making his morning rounds like a barracks sergeant. The doors opened with a bang, and he shouted orders for the boys to get up. "Up! New day, work to do! No slacking off!" Brett had been awake for hours. Sleep was a luxury he had rarely experienced lately. Lying in his narrow bed, he stared at the stained ceiling, trying to push away the weight that seemed to crush his chest. Dorothy. The image of his grandmother, with tubes in her nose and the heart monitor flashing next to her bed, wouldn't leave his mind. He got up quickly, pulling back the thin blanket to tidy the bed before Mr. Carter came in. The dormitory was a large room, with bunk beds lined up against the walls and worn cupboards in the corner. There was a constant smell of mold and disinfectant, a combination that Brett found almost unbearable. In the cafeteria, breakfast was simple: watery porridge and a slice of bread. Brett sat quietly, avoiding the stares of the other boys. He didn't like attracting attention. Most of them had learned to leave Brett alone. He was the boy with the guitar, an outsider who rarely got involved in fights or lively conversations. Some admired him for it, others despised him. Linda was there, moving efficiently around the kitchen, serving the dishes and scolding those who dared to ask for extra portions. When she passed Brett, she placed a small packet of cookies next to his tray without saying anything. He looked at her and smiled slightly, a silent thank you. After coffee, Brett had tasks assigned to him by the shelter. He swept the courtyard, washed clothes, and helped organize incoming supplies. But his mind was far away. He counted down the hours until the evening, when he could escape to the square again and sing. It was an exhausting but necessary cycle. Charleston was a city of stark contrasts. The historic streets, with their colonial houses and brick sidewalks, exuded an old, almost nostalgic charm. Tourists strolled around during the day, taking photos and buying souvenirs, but at night the streets were transformed. Some areas glowed with the light of the elegant restaurants and bars, while others, like the path Brett took to the square, plunged into shadows and silence. The central square was the vibrant heart of the city. During the day, it was filled with the energy of street vendors, street performers, and children playing around the fountain. But when the sun went down, the place took on a completely different atmosphere. The yellowish lights of the street lamps cast long shadows on the tall trees, and the sound of leaves swaying in the wind was the only noise apart from the voices of the musicians performing. This was where Thompson used to play. He had his fixed point under a lamppost near a 24-hour cafe. Next to it was a bench where Brett always sat before he started singing. There was something magical about the square for him. Despite its modest appearance, it was the one place where he felt he had some control over his life. When he sang, it was as if the world stopped, even for a few minutes. Dorothy was more than a grandmother to Brett. She was everything. As a child, he didn't understand why he didn't have parents like the other kids, but Dorothy always managed to make their absence less painful. "It's just the two of us, my love," she said, hugging him tightly. "And that's all we need." She was a strong woman, with hands calloused by hard work and a smile that lit up any room. Dorothy had spent years working as a maid, cleaning large houses to support Brett. Even with little money, she always managed to make sure he had what he needed, and sometimes even something extra like a piece of cake for his birthday. But now, all that seemed so far away. The Dorothy he knew was disappearing, stuck in a hospital bed, pale and frail. The doctor had been clear. Without surgery, she wouldn't survive. The problem was the exorbitant cost. Brett had overheard the conversation between the doctor and the social worker when he visited Dorothy. He stayed in the waiting room, but his words were crystal clear. There was no help available for her. If they didn't get the money, it would be the end. In the midst of this chaos, Linda became the only person Brett could trust. The shelter's cook was a sturdy woman, with grey hair tied up in a bun, and a straight-talking manner that intimidated most of the boys. But behind her stern facade, there was a genuine kindness. Linda had noticed Brett from the first day he arrived at the shelter. He was different, quiet, but with a determined look that intrigued her. When she caught him climbing out of the window one night, instead of scolding him, she decided to help him. "You're doing this for a good reason, aren't you?" she asked. And when she heard Dorothy's story, she knew she couldn't deny him her help. She set up a system so that he could leave and return without being caught. She left the back door unlocked and turned a blind eye when Mr. Carter asked about Brett. "If you get caught, it'll be my problem too," she warned him every night. "So be careful." Brett knew he owed Linda a lot. Without her, he would have had no chance of continuing his performances in the square. He always made an effort to bring her some of the money he earned. But Linda refused. "Save it for your grandmother," she would say. "She needs it more than I do." As the day wore on, Brett felt more and more anxious. He knew that time was against him. Dorothy's surgery needed to happen soon, but the money he could get from singing in the square was a drop in the ocean. Still, he had no other choice. It was this or giving up, and giving up was not an option. When the evening finally arrived, he got ready as usual. Linda was waiting for him in the back with the wrapped sandwich, and he made his way to the square with a heavy but determined heart. At every step, he repeated Dorothy's words to himself, "Never stop believing." The square was busier that evening. Thompson was already tuning his guitar when Brett arrived. The man smiled and waved at him. "Are you ready?" Brett nodded, taking a deep breath. He knew the battle would be long, but at that moment, under the flickering lights of the square, he felt something different, a spark of hope. The central square was alive that night. But for Brett, the sound of hurried footsteps and the conversations of strangers was just a backdrop to his growing anxiety. He adjusted his guitar behind his back, observing the few people who were already beginning to form small groups around Thompson. The musician was sitting under the usual lamppost, tuning his guitar with the precision of a craftsman. He waved to Brett with an encouraging smile, but the boy felt the weight of the moment like never before. "You look nervous," said Thompson when Brett came closer. His husky voice had a tone of concern. "Is everything all right?" Brett shrugged, trying to look unconcerned. "I'm fine. Just thinking. Thompson watched him for a moment before patting him on the shoulder. "Listen, kid, everyone has their rough days, but when you sing, it's like magic. No matter what's bothering you, you can make people feel something. That's rare." Thompson's words warmed Brett for a moment, but he knew that, however magical his performances seemed, the reality was cruel. The money he got wasn't enough. Every night that passed was another day lost for Dorothy. Even so, he couldn't give up. While Thompson adjusted the amplifier and prepared the microphone, Brett looked around. The square seemed more crowded than usual. A group of young people were sitting on the steps of the central fountain, laughing and drinking coffee. A woman with a shopping bag stopped to watch for a while a man with a child on his shoulders walked slowly, following the sound. Brett took a deep breath and adjusted the microphone. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm down. When he opened them, he saw a figure in the distance, an elegant woman standing on the other side of the street. She seemed distracted, but something about the way she was looking at him caught his attention. It was as if her eyes were fixed on him, even from a distance. Before he could think any more about it, Thompson began to play. The soft notes of the guitar filled the air, and Brett knew it was time to start. He held the microphone with both hands and let the first words come out of his mouth. His voice was clear, but charged with emotion. Each note seemed to pulse with the intensity of his pain and his hope. The sound cut through the cold of the night like a ray of sunshine through dark clouds. The conversations around the square slowed down. People began to stop, attracted by the melody. The woman across the street, Liza, came to a complete stop. Her heart raced when she heard the boy's voice. Something in that voice was incredibly familiar, but she couldn't understand why. Liza dropped her shopping bag on the ground without realizing it and crossed the street, moved by a force she couldn't explain. With each verse, the square seemed to get quieter. Even the sounds of cars passing in the distance seemed to disappear. It was as if time had stopped and everyone was trapped in the moment created by Brett's music. Liza approached slowly. She couldn't take her eyes off the boy, and the similarity of his voice to that of Christian, the man she had loved and lost years ago, was overwhelming. Memories began to surface, like a movie projected in her mind. Christian singing to her, his voice laden with passion and promise, but he had disappeared and taken a part of her heart with him. As the memories flooded her mind, Liza began to feel her legs weaken. The square swirled around her, and she tried to lean on something but found nothing. Before she could call out for help, her vision darkened, and she collapsed to the ground. The sound of Liza's body falling interrupted Brett's music. He stopped singing immediately, and Thompson stopped playing too. A small crowd gathered around the woman, and someone shouted, "Call an ambulance!" Brett looked at Thompson, confused and worried. "What happened?" he asked. But Thompson was already running towards Liza. Thompson knelt down next to Liza, trying to check that she was breathing. "Does anyone have any water?" he asked, looking at the crowd gathered around. A man with a bottle approached and handed it to him. Thompson dipped his hand in and lightly touched Liza's face. She started to move slightly but didn't open her eyes. "She'll be fine," Thompson said to the people around him. "But she needs medical help." He looked at Brett, who was motionless, holding the microphone with trembling hands. "Stay here, kid. I'll go with her." An ambulance arrived minutes later, and the paramedics put Liza on a stretcher. Thompson climbed into the vehicle with her, while Brett stayed behind, watching as the lights of the ambulance disappeared into the distance. He felt a knot in his stomach, as if something much bigger was about to happen, but he didn't know what. When Liza woke up in hospital, she was still confused. The first thing that came into her mind was the voice. That voice. She looked around, trying to remember where she was. Thompson was sitting beside her bed, his hands folded in his lap. "You fainted in the square," he said, his tone calm. "Are you all right?" Liza shook her head slowly. still trying to process what had happened. "That boy," she began, but her voice failed her. She took a deep breath and tried again. "The boy who was singing. Who is he?" Thompson frowned. "Brett? He's just a kid from the square. A good kid. Why?" Liza closed her eyes for a moment. She knew she had to find out more. Something about that boy wasn't right. "I need to find him," she said, her voice firmer now. "I need to talk to him." Thompson nodded but didn't ask any more questions. He knew when someone had a mission, and the determination on Liza's face was clear. Meanwhile, Brett walked back to the shelter with a strange feeling. He couldn't forget the look on the woman's face before he passed out. Who was she? And why did he feel that something in his life was about to change drastically? The next morning dawned with uncertainty. For Brett, the night before seemed like a blur. Mr. Carter's shrill voice echoed through the corridors of the shelter, but Brett was already awake, sitting on his bed with his guitar resting beside him. He couldn't shake the image of the woman fainting in the square. Something about her seemed different from the other people he saw every day. It wasn't just the fright or the drama of the moment. It was the intensity of her gaze before she fell. Meanwhile, on the other side of Charleston, Liza was determined. She didn't know why that boy had touched her so much, but she had to find out the truth. As soon as she was discharged from hospital, she set out. Thompson, who had stayed by her side overnight, provided what he knew. The boy's name was Brett, and he sang in the square almost every night. But there was something more important that Thompson mentioned. He lives in a shelter. I don't know which one, but I heard him mention it once. That little clue was enough to get Liza started. She was a practical woman, with the resources and determination to get to the bottom of the mystery. In her home office, she opened her laptop and began searching for local shelters. There were several, but her intuition told her it wouldn't be difficult to find Brett. He didn't seem like the kind of boy who blended in easily. At the shelter, Brett was finishing his daily chores when he heard voices in the hallway. One of them was Linda's, clearly in a worried tone, and the other, feminine but firm. He couldn't understand everything they were saying, but he picked up loose words: sing, square, important. His curiosity won out, and he peeked through the bedroom door. Liza was standing there with her hands folded and an expression of determination that seemed unshakable. Linda, who normally had absolute control over situations, was visibly uncomfortable. When Liza mentioned Brett's name, Linda stopped talking and glanced at the door. "Brett," Linda called, her voice softer than usual. "Come here, darling." Brett hesitated for a moment before leaving. He stared at Liza, trying to understand what she wanted. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of pain and expectation, that made him suspicious. "Are you Brett?" asked Liza, stepping forward. "Yes," he replied, pressing his lips together. "Who are you?" "My name is Liza," she said. "I heard you singing in the square last night. I need to talk to you about something important." Brett exchanged a glance with Linda, who looked as confused as he was. "Why?" he asked, feeling exposed. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, no," Liza answered quickly, shaking her head. "On the contrary, I think maybe you and I have a connection. Can you give me a few minutes to talk?" Brett didn't know what to think, but something in the sincerity of her voice made him agree. Linda accompanied them to the shelter's small drawing room, where Liza started asking questions. She wanted to know about his life, his grandmother Dorothy, and how he had started singing. As Brett talked, Liza began to put the pieces of the puzzle together in her mind. The name Dorothy made her breathing quicken. She knew that name. It was the name of Christian's mother, the man she had loved and lost. She needed to confirm it. "Do you think I could visit your grandmother?" asked Liza, trying to remain calm. "I'd like to meet her." Brett hesitated. Dorothy was in no condition to receive visitors, but something in Liza's voice made him want to trust her. "She's in hospital," he replied. "I can take her there, but she's not very well." Liza nodded, trying to hide the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overflow. At the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant invaded Liza's nostrils as she followed Brett to Dorothy's room. The boy opened the door slowly, revealing an elderly woman lying in bed with oxygen tubes connected to her nose and a heart monitor flashing next to her. Despite her frailty, there was something strong in the way she looked at Brett when he entered. "Hi, Grandma," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "I've brought someone to meet you." Dorothy smiled slightly, but her expression turned serious when she saw Liza enter. Something in Liza's eyes made her freeze. She seemed to recognize the woman immediately. "You're—" began Dorothy, but her voice faltered. Liza stepped forward, her eyes watering. "You know me," she said, more as a statement than a question. "You're Dorothy, Christian's mother." Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them, there was a deep sadness in them. "Yes," she said, her voice hoarse. "I am." Brett looked from one to the other, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Dorothy took a deep breath, as if she was about to carry a weight she had been holding for years. "Brett, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." She looked at Liza before continuing. "Your father, Christian, didn't die the way I said. He ran away when you were a baby. He fell in love with another woman and decided to raise you with her in Charleston. But fate was cruel. Shortly after arriving here, he had a car accident and died." Dorothy paused, tears starting to stream down her face. "I didn't know who his mother was. I couldn't remember her name. I didn't know where to look. And I thought it would be easier to say that they had both died. It was a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry." Brett remained silent, the words hammering away in his head. He looked at Liza, who was now crying openly. "So my suspicions were right." "I'm your mother, Brett," she said, her voice breaking. "I looked for you for years, but I never knew you were here. I never knew that Christian had left you with your grandmother." Brett took a step back, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at Dorothy, at Liza, and back at Dorothy. "Did you lie to me, Grandma?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did you know my mother was alive all this time?" "I thought I was protecting you," Dorothy replied, sobbing. "I thought I was doing what was best." "Better?" cried Brett, tears now falling freely. "I grew up thinking I was an orphan, and you knew that wasn't true?" Liza tried to move closer, but Brett took another step back. He felt a mixture of anger, confusion, and sadness that was impossible to process. I need to get out of here," he said, before running out of the room. Liza looked at Dorothy, her eyes full of pain, but there was also something else, understanding. "He needs time," she said. "So do I." Dorothy nodded, feeling the weight of her choices more than ever. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I just wanted to protect him." Liza took a deep breath, wiping away her tears. "My suffering over all these years has been terrible. Losing all my childhood, my son's growth, not knowing where he was, if he was all right. It destroyed me inside. But I can't blame you. It was Christian who caused all this. I still need to digest this story, but I know it wasn't your fault." "Thank you for taking care of my son, Dorothy," she said, her voice firm despite her emotion. "But now, it's my turn to look after you." Brett didn't know how long he stood in the doorway of the hospital room. In front of him, Dorothy and Liza, two women who now defined parts of his life that he had barely begun to understand, watched him in silence. Each carried different expressions. Dorothy, of regret and fear. Liza, of hope and expectation. And Brett, in the midst of it all, felt the crushing weight of having to confront emotions he couldn't name. He finally took a step into the room. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, but he knew he couldn't run away forever. "I don't know what to say," Brett began, his voice low, as if the words were stones he needed to carry. He looked at Dorothy first. "You lied to me, Grandma. All my life. I believed I was alone because you said it was true. And now I find out that it wasn't real. I always trusted you, Grandma." Dorothy looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I know, son," she replied, her voice trembling. "I know what I did was wrong. I was scared, Brett. I lost my son, and you were all I had left. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I only hurt you." "You did," Brett admitted, his voice still shaking. "A lot." Dorothy sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "If I could go back in time, I would have told you everything. I would have investigated who your mother was and done everything I could to find her." Brett looked at her for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. "I know you love me," he said, his words laden with pain. "And I love you too, Grandma. But I need time to understand all this." Dorothy nodded slowly, still crying. "I'll wait as long as it takes, darling." Brett then turned to Lisa. She was standing still, looking hesitant, as if she didn't know what to do or say. "And you," he began, with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You're my mother. I don't even know what that means." Liza took a step forward, her eyes watering. "It means that I love you," she said, her voice breaking, "even without knowing you, even without knowing where you were. I've loved you every day of my life since you were taken from me." Liza's words hit Brett hard. He wanted to believe her, but the hole left by years of abandonment, or what he thought was abandonment, was still there. "I don't know if I can call you mother yet," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "I need time." "I understand," Liza replied, trying to hold back tears, "and I'm willing to wait. What matters is that I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." As they left the hospital after this tense conversation, Lisa noticed that Brett was restless, fiddling with his fingers and looking at the floor. She knew that the boy was carrying a huge weight, even though he was so young. She also knew that if she wanted to be part of his life, she would have to win him over little by little. "You look thoughtful," said Liza, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it that made Brett look up. "I know today was an emotional day. I'm still impacted too, but there seems to be something else. What's bothering you?" Brett hesitated. He had never been the type to share his feelings easily, but something about Liza, perhaps the way she spoke, or how sincere her eyes seemed, made him want to open up. He took a deep breath and looked directly at her. "I'm worried about the surgery." I sing every day to raise money for my grandmother's surgery," he said at once, as if the words had been stuck for a long time. "She needs heart surgery, and there was no other way to raise the money." Liza was silent for a moment, processing what she had just heard. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She felt a mixture of pride and pain. Pride in Brett's selfless heart, but pain at the thought of what he had gone through to try to save Dorothy. "Are you singing to pay for your grandmother's surgery?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky. Brett nodded, unable to hide the emotion on his face. "Yes, some people throw in coins, sometimes notes. It's not much, but it's what I can do." Liza leaned forward, her expression now fully focused on Brett. "Do you do this every night?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes," replied Brett. "I do it because I can't lose my grandmother. She's all I have. She was. Now I have you too, I guess." These words broke Liza's heart. She realized more than ever how much Brett had carried alone. It was a burden no little boy should have to bear. She reached out and touched his hand, squeezing it gently. "Brett," she began, her voice firm now but full of emotion, "you don't have to do this alone. I'll take care of your grandmother's surgery. I'll find the best doctor there is, and I'll make sure she gets all the care she needs to recover." Brett blinked, surprised. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. Liza squeezed his hand once more, looking directly into his eyes. "I promise, Brett. You've already done more than any boy should. Now it's my turn to help." It took a while to sink in, but when it did, Brett's expression changed. He felt a huge weight being lifted off his shoulders, as if for the first time in months he could take a deep breath without feeling that tightness in his chest. He looked at Liza, and for the first time he saw in her more than a stranger. He saw someone he could trust. Without a second thought, Brett stood up and took a step towards Liza, throwing his arms around her in a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." Liza felt tears welling up, but this time she didn't try to hide them. She hugged Brett tightly, as if making up for lost years. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "I am your mother, and looking after you and Dorothy is the least I can do." The moment lasted a few seconds, but for Brett, it felt like a beginning. A new beginning, where he was no longer alone. He slowly pulled away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, but still with a shy smile on his face. "So does that mean I don't have to sing every night?" he joked, his voice carrying a hint of relief. Liza laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Not out of necessity," she said. "But if you want to sing, I want to be there to listen. You seem to have a special talent." Brett laughed back, a rare but genuine sound. He knew there was still a lot to overcome, but for the first time, he felt he had a chance to fight for something better, not just for Dorothy, but for himself. On the day of the surgery, Brett was at Dorothy's bedside, holding her hand. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke for themselves. He had chosen to stay by her side, even with the pain of the revelation still throbbing in his heart. "I love you, Brett," said Dorothy, her voice weak but full of emotion. "I love you too, Grandma," he replied with a small smile. "No matter what's happened, I love you." Dorothy was taken to the operating room, leaving Liza and Brett in the waiting room. The silence between them was different from before. It was no longer one of tension, but of expectation. Liza glanced at Brett from time to time, wanting to say something, but not knowing how to start. "Why did he run away?" asked Brett suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost as if he didn't really want to hear the answer. "My father? Why did he leave you?" Liza sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I wanted to know too," she answered honestly. "But he never gave me an explanation. One day he was there saying he loved me, and the next, he was gone. He just disappeared. I never heard from him again." Brett processed this for a moment before asking, "Did you hate him?" Liza shook her head. "No," she said. "I was angry. I was hurt. But I never hated him, and I don't think I'll ever hate him because he gave me you." Brett looked at her, trying to understand how someone could forgive so easily. Perhaps, he thought, that was something he needed to learn too. The surgery was a success, but Dorothy still needed time to recover. Liza arranged a comfortable room for her in her house, insisting that Brett and Dorothy move in. At first, Brett resisted the idea. He didn't know if he was ready to live under the same roof as Liza, but Dorothy, still fragile, needed constant care, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. In their new home, living together was initially marked by small steps. Liza made a point of giving Brett his space, but she was always there, offering help or trying to start conversations. Dorothy, for her part, took advantage of every moment to help establish the bond between mother and son. Over time, Brett began to open up. He began to share his memories, his pain, and even his dreams. Liza, for her part, told stories of her search for him, of the moments of despair and hope that marked her journey. A few weeks later, the central square was illuminated by soft lights, and the sound of a guitar filled the air. Brett was there, back on the makeshift stage under the lamppost, but something in his posture was different. He was more confident, lighter. The crowd around him was bigger than ever. Thompson stood to the side, strumming his guitar with a proud smile. Linda, the shelter's cook, was in the front row, wiping away tears as she watched the boy she had helped so much. But at the center of the crowd were Dorothy and Liza. The grandmother, now stronger, was smiling broadly, while Liza couldn't take her eyes off Brett. He looked at them for a moment before starting to sing. His voice, so pure and full of emotion, seemed to reach every single person present, touching hearts in a way that few others could. When he finished, the applause was deafening. Brett got down from the small stage and went straight to Dorothy and Liza. He hugged them, feeling for the first time that he was where he was supposed to be, surrounded by love and acceptance. Over the next few months, Brett's life changed completely. He continued to sing, but now it was no longer out of desperation or necessity. It was out of passion. He, Dorothy and Liza began to build a new life together, learning to be a family despite the mistakes and hurts of the past. As he walked through the square one evening with Thompson by his side, Brett looked up at the sky and smiled. He knew there was still a lot to face, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was no longer alone. He had his voice, his dream, and above all, his family.